The Gulf Coast Growth Show is sponsored by Chevron Pasadena Refinery and is an extension of the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region, where our mission is to market and grow a vibrant regional economy. Welcome to the Gulf Coast Growth Show. This is Chad Burke, president of the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region, and I'm here today with a friend of mine, Garrett Gish. Garrett and I had the opportunity to attend a trade mission over to Turkey about a month and a half ago now. And I got to learn a lot about the work that he's doing. And we got to spend some good time together and really talk about how what he does really bolsters and helps affect what we do in economic development. So Garrett, happy for you to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate you coming to the east side of town.
That's
where we
right.
do all the work over here.
Easy drive.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Garrett Gish and how you got to where you are right now and what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Chad. Appreciate it. And it was great to spend some time with you in Turkey. Easy drive for me over here, so I'm happy to come back anytime and talk about it. My background is I've got a Texas nexus, if you will. Both my parents are from San Antonio and Houston, respectively. My dad was a Navy fighter pilot. So even though I was born in Corpus, I spent a number of years around the world. So I grew up in California and Japan and in Florida. Spent most of my time, though, in Texas and went to undergrad at Colgate University, upstate New York. And then I spent 6 years United States Army at 5th Special Forces Group as a Green Beret. Following that, I came back to Houston, helped manage a family company. We're doing some industrial manufacturing, doing basically HVAC supplies and services for those HVAC industries in about a 5-state region. Went to business school at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. After graduating there, I started working at a private equity group here in Houston that was managing an Africa fund. Mm-hmm. And that was really my first foray into the developing markets from a non-operational standpoint. Obviously, in the military, I spent time in Afghanistan, I spent time in Iraq. But from an investment standpoint and a non-military operational standpoint, my first foray into developing markets, we were managing a fund that had exposure to about 11 different African countries. I worked there for almost 4 years before branching out on my own to start a private equity platform purposed for investment in developing markets. There's namely a focus in the African markets, but set this up as a conduit for investment opportunities in the developing markets at large. So think Latin America, Central Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and obviously Africa as kind of the target geography, I should say, for investment. So as it sits today, we've got a number of different equity holdings across electric motorcycles, coffee, craft brewery, which is kind of an interesting investment, and obviously a number of real estate projects in a very diversified way, industrial, housing, hospitality, and in a pretty diversified geographic spread. So we're in about 14 different African countries as it sits today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you initially say that managing private equity funds and developing countries, so there's an immediate reaction from a lot of people that is like, wait a second, is that the right place to go to invest, right? Yeah. But in talking with you and learning a little bit more about kind of how you do it, there's great opportunities there too. So talk us through kind of what you.
100%. Yes. Yeah. It's not a lot of people can point to Africa, let alone specific African countries on a map, but the opportunities, and I'll stick with Africa just for context. The opportunity in Africa, when you look at from a big picture standpoint, you've got from the demographics, 1.4 billion people. You got 54 countries. You got 5 out of the top 10 fastest growing countries in the world. Mm-hmm. You've got one of the youngest populations in the entire world. I think the median age across the continent is about 19. And so when you start putting all those things together, it's a really compelling investment case to say, this is a region that I should be looking at. And obviously you can kind of differentiate. There's more attractive markets within the general continent itself. But I think the underlying macroeconomic trends and demographics that are there are compelling enough to at least start looking at those. And that was, I obviously had an opportunity to do that at my previous fund. And on the back of that, really built this as an underlying thesis as to why we should be going into these markets, those trends, those fundamentals that are there. I think beyond that, when you start looking at the capital markets, so you just take the US, for example, the United States has about a $33 trillion institutional capital market pool. Less than 1% of that is invested in Africa. So when you look at what the delta is between a portfolio diversification, what you would think if you've got a population in a certain continent that's almost 4 times that of the United States, you've got all these rapidly expanding economies, you've got all the natural resources, the entire world are concentrated on this continent. Why aren't we looking at investment there? And I think, to your point earlier, there's a perception there. Not a lot of people have been. There's a perception of risk that I think is inherent with some of the historical things that have happened in Africa, a lot of lack of education that comes along with that. And I think Woody Allen has this great quote where he talks about 80% of success is just showing up.
Yeah.
And so for me, actually just showing up in some of these markets and understanding what is happening on the ground and taking a look at what is their existing infrastructure, what are the people like, what are they doing in terms of, building their own economies, and what are the opportunities there? A lot of those opportunities we see as just a result of being there, and it's not just not one specific industry. It's not one specific investment. I mean, it's across the board. And I think, we were talking before we started the show about another market where you've got a number of different ministers that are coming in saying, hey, these are different opportunities, whether it's healthcare, whether it's energy, whether it's, you name it, technology. Those opportunities, I think, are prevalent in every single one of those markets, which is why we set this company up to be a platform to go to some of these markets, not just Africa specifically, but the same opportunities that you might see in Nigeria, for example, are also prevalent in Turkey, or also prevalent in Kazakhstan, or in Peru, or any other Latin American country. You see those same opportunities. And so if you can identify, source, and diligence those deals, and then bring them to larger US institutions that for whatever reason do not have an exposure there, and oftentimes it's not because they don't want international exposure, it's because nobody's bringing them the right opportunities.
Exactly. Nobody's been there, right? Nobody's, like you say. And I love the analogy of, hey, 80% is just showing up, right? Because in our role, we see it. And like you said, we were talking about it earlier today, and we entertain groups from around the world here at the Economic Alliance throughout the year, every year. And there is a thirst for the prosperity and the way of life that we have in America, right? So there are good people in countries that have for whatever reason are still developing, right? But there are good people there trying to do good things for their country, and that's kind of the message that I get over and over when I talk to folks from other countries. They're like, "Hey, we want the good things for our country. We want our people to elevate to the middle class, and we want to be able to raise and educate our kids." What you're doing with your investments are providing the opportunity for those countries to kind of take their resources, match it with investment, and be able to kind of raise their standard of living, if you will, right? And at the same time, then on the backside, you're doing a good job for your investors here in the U.S., or whether it's a pension fund or whatever it is that the money's maybe coming from, right?
Yeah, I think the largest portion of economic growth for a lot of these developing markets is foreign direct investment. So, like I mentioned before, you got $33 trillion in the U.S. There's $146 trillion, or projected to be by 2026, $146 trillion in the institutional capital markets. Now, when you look at that in the context of these developing markets, the lion's share is in, your developed Western world. It is in the US and it's in Europe. Places like Nigeria and Zambia and Malawi get a very, very small percentage of that, if any. So that's a real opportunity. But I think when you talk about value proposition for investing, I think what we look at is really 4 different things. Obviously, the returns have to be first and foremost for a lot of these institutions, especially the guys that are managing the funds on the investment committees or chief investment officers, because ultimately they have a fiduciary responsibility. So the returns have to be there. And I think that those opportunities that we look at in these developing markets oftentimes create those returns that you would not be able to get otherwise in the developed market. But number 2 is, I think there's a diversification that I think is inherent to any portfolio, or at least should be from a fiduciary standpoint. But I think there's 2 other things that are applicable to those types of investments, regardless of either the specific geography in a more developing markets context. One is there is inherent support of U.S. foreign policy objectives in a lot of these investment opportunities, especially in markets that are subject to influence to a lot of other countries. I look at countries like China that has really done a ton of investment in the African continent. I mean, some of these countries I go into Malawi, and there's China aid flags everywhere. And people love to say, oh, well, China is doing this and China's doing that. But, to their credit, and this isn't like a pro-China thing, but to their credit, they are showing up and they are making the investments there.
Yep.
And we can sit here and say, well, they shouldn't be taking the money from them, or there's debt trap diplomacy or whatever it is. But the reality is nobody else is bringing the check to say we're gonna fund this 300-kilometer road between Blantyre and the Long Way, whatever it is.
Yep.
I think there's also some other countries, obviously, countries like Russia that have also demonstrated some influence in regions, and a lot of that political influence that we are lacking in places is simply the result of not making the investments there.
Yeah.
And if we're not making the investments in there, then why does anybody need to pay us any time or attention as a country for any of the agendas that we want to, say, hey, you guys should be, operating a more pro-democratic process within your elections, or you should be, helping support this type of whatever it is. And then the last thing I'll say is there's an impact element that is inherent with any one of these investments. When you take a look at economic growth, when you take a look at job creation, every one of these investments in countries, people are starved for jobs.
Yep.
I mean, I mentioned this earlier. You got the median age in some of these countries is 19. Everybody is looking for a job. They're looking for skills and training that come along with that kind of stuff. This is why I love the hospitality industry. We've got a couple of hotels that we're underwriting right now with Four Seasons in places like you wouldn't think, in Lagos, Nigeria, or in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. These are opportunities to make obviously flagship investments that bring a lot of attention to a specific country. You've got foreign travelers coming in, identifying an asset like that, saying, I want to stay there. But the more important thing is internally, you've got 3 times the number of jobs that are required for an operational standpoint for a hotel like Four Seasons versus some, 3-star brand, and nothing wrong with those. There's a place for those. But you got 3 times the number of jobs. There's an elevation of service standards. The World Bank, through its development arm, IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has a great white paper on why they invest in upscale hotels. Because of this job creation component, because of the elevation of service standards that comes along with that, because of the higher dollar amount, which creates a foreign direct investment opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of these things in the impact realm that come along with making these types of investments. But the important thing is, like I said, kind of stair step down a waterfall, if you will. You've got to have the returns.
Yep.
You've got to have that diversification play for a portfolio. And I think the advent of having a pro-U.S. agenda and foreign policy support as part of that, and the impact as a secondary and tertiary outcome, I think is really important and a very compelling case to make for investing in some of these markets.
Yeah, it's when you're a developing country, and we see this over and over, and it plays into our petrochemical industry, and I'll explain why in a second. But when you're a developing country, it's like you say, you'll take help from pretty much whoever's willing to give it, right? And not to get political, but it's a long-term relationship when it's a business relationship, when you've got investments there that are from U.S. companies, that eventually, it replaces us having to put soldiers there,
right?
Because you've got great relations, you've got commerce coming back and forth. There's nothing like, good friends that do business together, don't fight each other. They're not normally going to war with each other. Yeah. And we see that over and over again. And there really is, the word that comes to mind is there's a thirst for U.S. investment. And we see that in conversations. You obviously do it all the time, but in here at the Economic Alliance, when we have the opportunity to talk to delegates from other countries, it's always just striking how they want the prosperity that we have here and the ability to facilitate those types of projects that raise people from poverty to middle class, and begin introducing education and things like that into countries like that. It only helps the U.S. in the long run. Yeah. The point about the petrochemical industry is we've seen in excess of $100 billion worth of investment here in the last 10, 15 years now. It started in about 2011. So just astronomical investment, right? And the way that industry leaders put it to me, about halfway into this kind of renaissance, if you will, in the chemical manufacturing along the Gulf Coast is Chad, we have made for decades the products that we consume domestically. But we can't compete globally because the price of our feedstock, which is primarily natural gas, was never there to be able to compete globally. So we made what we consumed, and we didn't export very little resins, polymers, specialty chemicals, not a lot. Almost every bit of the over $100 billion in investment that has happened in the last decade is going overseas because we can do it competitively now. But what it's doing is it's taking the products that make standard of living, like glasses that don't break every time I drop them, or our cell phones, or our clothes, or our safety in our automobiles, or the food packaging that makes food survive 4 times, 5 times longer being fresh. All of that comes from petrochemicals, and we now are shipping that to the rest of the world, where still, there's between 8 and 9 billion people on the planet right now, and 3.5, almost 4 billion of them still live in developing countries like Africa, still use wood and all kinds of different products to burn and heat and their homes and things like that. What we're doing is providing them with a product at a price that they can raise themselves up out of poverty and kind of begin to grasp hold of the middle class. And projects like yours into those countries only facilitate that, right? It's us being good with our resources is what it's being. So
and I think there's the capital gap is obviously there, as I alluded to before, but the capital gap is also there because the size of the projects that are required to get some of these economies where they need to be. I mean, there's a baseline infrastructure that is absent in a lot of the markets that is needed. There are hotels in a lot of the markets, but a lot of the higher end hotels that a lot of international guests might look for are not there. You think of the top 4 brands: Hyatt, Hilton, Marriott, IHG. They got 20,000 assets between them globally, less than 400 in Africa. And 1.4 billion people, you got less than 400 assets. So there's the road infrastructure that is pretty good in a lot of the municipalities. But when you want to connect Lagos to Abuja, or you want to go from Abidjan to wherever else in West Africa, those types of infrastructure elements are oftentimes missing in a way that makes it a lot more efficient and can allow those economies to grow. Those are mega billion-dollar projects. And most people can't point to Ivory Coast on the map. And so then when you start adding that risk perception in, it becomes a very difficult barrier to overcome for people to say, we need $30 billion to do this road. So you got this big community of development financial institutions, and every major G20 government's got some sort of organization or government agency that is tasked with mandated, I should say, with making those types of investments. But the real scalability here is trying to identify larger institutions in the U.S. that are looking for these types of investment opportunities. And we were talking about this earlier. What's interesting is that this may not seem like at its face, like how does this relate to what you guys are doing here, and how does it relate to the Houston economy and Texas economy at large? But when you look at the pension funds that are here, just public pension funds, there's like 125 pension funds in Texas. Between Houston and Galveston, there are 12. I mean, this is hundreds of billions of dollars, and then millions of people within the state, just in the public pension fund plans, that are subject to those capital pools that do not have allocations to some of these markets. And so there's I think, a prosperity that can become very prevalent within this economy specifically, because I think there are a number of pension funds here that have made investments in the past. Texas Teachers has made some allocations to the African markets in the past. There's 1 or 2 others that I think UTIMCO has made an allocation to the African market before. But that opportunity is there, and it can kind of create prosperity for the general population here that are, the pensioners, if you will. And they have exposure to some of these funds. And so as those funds can grow and take advantage of these opportunities that we're out trying to source in markets that nobody else is really operating in, I think that creates an opportunity for alpha for us to kind of grow this local market.
Very good. Very good. So this is high level finance, in my opinion, right? This is Garrett Gish.
That's right. That's right.
Doing good work for not only the people in Africa, but then the pensioners here back in the U.S. as well. So very good. So let's swing over a little bit. So you mentioned in your background, you had some great military experience, and let's talk about your professional success and how that's been affected by your military experience and your global kind of view or window into the world. Talk a little bit about how that may have kind of shaped and framed where you are right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I had a very unique experience. I mean, a lot of the guys that were on detachments, either my detachment or other sister companies, if you will, and other groups. And even guys that were on SEAL teams and, the force recon guys and that kind of stuff. Some of the fighter pilot friends that I have from business school, my brother's still a Marine pilot.
Yep.
Everybody's got a little bit different experience. I feel like mine was a little bit unique in that I did the kind of your standard run of the mill Afghanistan rotation as deployment, doing all the direct action. When I went to Iraq, my detachment was the first team back in Iraq in 2014. We'd pulled everybody out in 2011. 2014 rolls around, ISIS rears its head. Everybody's who is this ISIS? They're coming towards Baghdad. So I got an opportunity, or I guess I got a call from my team that had an opportunity, I should say, but it was orders that came down and said, hey, your team is going to Iraq. And you're going to take the Baghdad International Airport. You're going to secure the airfield, and then we're going to start running operations from there as a kind of the starting point, the foundation for what became Operation Inherent Resolve, which was basically the war on ISIS to do that. So it was really unique for me to be in a position where you're the only detachment on the ground. Everybody that we're talking to is CENTCOM, General Austin, and it's Chuck Hagel, it's Secretary of Defense, and it's going up to POTUS level. But you're also working with a number of U.S. government agencies. I was tasked with managing 5 different Iraqi intelligence agencies. And so when you start working in these capacities, and every agency and organization has its own culture, you're working with different nationalities, you're working with different personalities. I think that put me in a really unique position to understand and have experience working across organizational lines in a way that not a lot of people have done. And obviously, that was a coalition tasked towards one purpose. And then that purpose was eliminating ISIS. That was very clear task and purpose that we had for that. But there's a similar kind of coalition that comes along with making these investments in a lot of the developing markets. And that task and purpose is just differentiated in that it's economic development and generating returns and, seeing through a successfully executed project, creating the jobs and whatever else, comes along with that. There's an African phrase that's very popular called "it takes a village." Like it takes a village to raise a child. Yeah. I think that's equally applicable in the investment sphere, if you will, because I can't walk into Nigeria and say, I'm going to plant this capital here and this is going to be the investment. That's what I'm doing. I have to have local partners. I got to work with the government in some capacity. I have to have these partners here from the US from an institutional capital standpoint. And so there's a coordination and a consortium and a synchronization that comes along in a very similar way to the military. Yep. That I think is required to be successful especially in these developing markets in a way that I don't think is really applicable if you're making an investment in Oklahoma. Yeah. Nothing wrong with Oklahoma, but it's just a much simpler process to do that. And you have to have these other partners that are in place.
Well, and the fact that you walked through that kind of a scenario in the military, it really just kind of opens your mind to the type of, the possibilities and the capabilities and the kind of the mental hurdles that people put in front of themselves that you're like, no, I've walked this path before. I understand how to deal with these different cultures and different governments. And it just, once you see it and have lived it, it's like, okay, my mind's open to that. And that leads to, great success in the private.
And I think you realize that, there are really, really good people all over the world. And some of these people are just looking for an opportunity. Yeah. Whether it's I just want a job, or if you're a government leader, I just want some institutions to take a chance on investing. We were talking about that earlier. I mean, that's not unique to that market. Everybody's like that. Just take a chance on coming in here. because the people that are there are some of the best people that I've met. Some of the opportunities I see are the best opportunities I've ever seen in my entire life from an investment standpoint. It's really just getting people to rally around the idea that you're going to do something that is going to create a positive outcome in a specific geography, and you can get it done. I go to some of these investment forums and summits with a lot of these investors. And the crazy thing is you're sitting in a room and every single person that you need to be successful in doing a deal is in that room at any given time. I mean, you've got your debt underwriters and you've got your equity partners and you've got your operating partners and your whatever it is. Everybody's there. The challenge is just getting everybody together in one consortium to say, this is a project we're going to do and make it happen. And I think that's what's often been lacking in a lot of these markets, is not only being able to do that, but having the willingness to go into a market that a lot of people aren't in and saying, this is what we're going to do and this is who we're going to do it with and make it happen.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And I've really enjoyed getting to know you and look forward to kind of working with you in the future. It's since I've met Garrett, I've had several different opportunities that will come through our Economic Alliance office, and I'm like, hey, Garrett, you need to talk to this guy, you need to meet this guy, or you need to meet this person. So it's been interesting to kind of see that unfold, and I'm sure it will continue.
Yeah, and vice versa. I think there's a lot of opportunities that we're seeing in markets where I'm pointing them this direction, and not just specific here the Economic Alliance, but just the Texas market in general. And, coming in here and saying, all right, well, how can we create some sort of trade dynamic here? And I'm hopeful that we'll get to do some delegations together in the future. But one of the big takeaways for me is, especially in a delegation like in Turkey, it's just like a lot of people have perceptions on that market in particular. Like, oh, well, that's what about that market? That was probably the most spectacular airport I have ever been in my entire life.
Without a doubt.
Just blew me away. And then you come back to, it's like, all right. And so when you took those into context, it's like, all right, well, why aren't we looking at a place like this? Why aren't we taking opportunities? So anyways, I look forward to continuing those discussions and working to kind of create this trade between a lot of these developing markets and here in the local Texas market.
Very good. Very good. Well, thanks much for coming to this side of town. Thanks for being on the podcast. Hopefully we'll hear from Garrett again in the future. But for me, Chad Burke in the Economic Alliance, thanks a lot. I think according to our regular host, I'm supposed to say like, share, repost, do whatever you can to get the word out and share the podcast. But thanks for joining us today.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to go to the Economic Alliance Houston Port Region website and subscribe to our channels. And let's pay it forward by sharing the good news of what's happening in our region by passing this episode to somebody you know.